The officers arrived within 4 minutes. 2 squad cars, 3 officers, hands on belts, scanning the sidewalk for the threat. What they found was a woman in a silk blouse standing in front of a locked storefront, a set of keys in her hand and 100 silver balloons tied to the door handle. Denise Okafor didn't flinch when the lights flashed, didn't raise her hands, didn't cry. She'd spent 11 years preparing for this morning, and she was not going to let Raymond Hollis, the man who'd called the police on her from across the street, take one more thing from her. She stood perfectly still as the officers approached and let them come. Because what they didn't know, what Raymond Hollis had never bothered to learn in 3 years of watching her from his shop window, was that the storefront behind her didn't belong to some stranger loitering on his block. It belonged to her. And in 23 minutes, when the ribbon cutting began, every person in that town would know it. 3 years earlier, Denise Okafor drove down Cedar Lane for the first time and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. The block was older, a stretch of brickfront retail in a mid-sized Ohio town that had seen better decades. But it wasn't dead. A florist on the corner, a hardware store, a barbershop that had been there since 1978, and between the barbershop and the dry cleaner, a vacant storefront with a sun-faded for lease sign and windows so dirty you couldn't see through them. Denise pulled over and pressed her face to the glass anyway. She could see the bones. 12-foot ceilings, original hardwood floors under what looked like 30 years of grime, a back room that could become a workroom, a counter that could become a bakery case. She already knew what she'd put there. She'd known for years. Denise had grown up in her grandmother's kitchen in Cleveland, learning the recipes that had traveled from Lagos to London to Ohio in a tin recipe box held together with rubber bands. Her grandmother, Mama Shisam, had cooked for church, for funerals, for weddings, for anyone who walked in hungry. She'd never had a business, never had a space, just a kitchen and hands that could make anything taste like love. When Mama Chisam passed, she left Denise the recipe box, a hand-stitched apron, and a note that said simply, "Stop waiting. Open the door." Denise had carried that note in her wallet for 9 years before she finally had enough saved to try. She was 41 years old. She had a culinary certificate from the community college, 11 years working as a line cook at 3 different restaurants, a catering side business she'd run out of her apartment, and $87.00 in savings she'd built dollar by dollar through doubles, holidays, and every birthday gift she'd redirected into a business account. She had everything except the courage to go first. Until she pressed her face against that dirty window on Cedar Lane and felt her grandmother tap her on the shoulder from somewhere she couldn't see. She signed the lease on March 14th. She had a business name, a logo, and a menu. What she didn't have, not yet, was any idea who her neighbor across the street would turn out to be. Raymond Hollis had owned Hollis Home Goods for 22 years. He'd inherited the store from his father, who'd built it from a single hardware aisle and a prayer in 1981. Under Raymond's management, the store had contracted, then stabilized, then contracted again as the big box stores moved in on the highway. What was left was a medium-sized shop selling mid-range cookware, candles, decorative linens, and the kind of items people picked up when they needed a last-minute wedding gift. It wasn't thriving, but it was surviving. Raymond told himself that was enough. Raymond told himself a lot of things. He'd watched tenants come and go in the vacant storefront across the street for a decade. Hair salon that lasted 8 months. A phone repair place that cleaned out its own inventory and vanished. The vacancy had become normal, almost comfortable. Empty storefronts didn't compete with you. Empty storefronts didn't draw foot traffic that might walk past your window and keep going. Raymond had never examined that particular feeling too closely. It wasn't something he was proud of. But it was something he acted on. The first time Denise came to clean her new space, she waved at Raymond through his display window. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned away. She assumed he was busy. She wasn't wrong exactly. He was just busy telling himself things again. The renovations took 8 months. Denise did as much as she could herself, spending weekends stripping floors, scrubbing ceilings, learning how to install commercial kitchen equipment from YouTube videos and a retired contractor named Harold who lived 2 blocks over and took his payment in jollof rice. She hired local when she needed licensed work. Electrician from the neighborhood, plumber her catering clients had recommended. Every receipt stayed local because Denise believed that was how you built something that lasted. You anchored it to the people around you. You made yourself part of the fabric. Every few weeks, she noticed Raymond watching from his doorway. She always waved. He never waved back. By the time the countertops were installed and the ovens connected, Denise had developed a familiar rhythm on Cedar Lane. She arrived early, left late, said good morning to the florist, talked soccer with the barber, dropped off test pastries for the dry cleaner's staff. She knew the mail carrier by name, the parking enforcement officer by the route she ran, the woman who walked her terrier past the block every morning at 7:15. She was building something. And it wasn't just the bakery. But Raymond Hollis watched the lights come on later and later in that storefront, watched the smell of spices and baked bread start to drift across Cedar Lane on certain mornings, and instead of curiosity, he felt something darker. He told himself it was territorial. Business concern. That a new food establishment would draw the kind of foot traffic that drove past his window without stopping. He called the city twice about her renovation permits, certain something must be out of order. Both times he was told everything was filed correctly and approved. He didn't call a third time, but he didn't stop watching. The week before the grand opening, Denise began decorating. Gold lettering on the window. Chisholm's. Hand-painted in a font her graphic designer had matched to her grandmother's handwriting. She hung a photo inside the front door. Mama Chisholm in her kitchen, 1974, laughing at someone off camera. She set the bakery case with practice batches that she distributed to every business on the block. Chin-chin, meat pies, puff-puff, almond croissants, pepper-spiced cinnamon rolls, small pots of Mama Chisholm's groundnut soup available by order. The barber ate 4 chin-chins standing in the doorway and said, "You're going to kill it." The florist cried a little over the soup and then apologized for crying, which made Denise cry, and they stood there crying together on the sidewalk while Harold the retired contractor walked by, saw them, and quietly turned around to give them privacy. The third call Raymond made to the city came 8 days before the opening. This time, it wasn't about permits. He called the health department, reporting a concern about ventilation in the new commercial kitchen. An inspector visited the next morning and spent 45 minutes going through every system in the building, asking Denise detailed questions about the exhaust hood and suppression system. She left with nothing to cite. "Everything's in excellent order," the inspector told Denise at the door. "Better than most operations I've seen. Honestly, whoever flagged this must have had different expectations." Denise thanked her, closed the door, and stood with her back against it for a moment. She already knew who had flagged it. She'd seen Raymond watching the inspector arrive, watching her come back out empty-handed. 3 years of this. She'd been naive to think it would stop before the opening. She was not going to spend what was left of that week on Raymond Hollis. She turned back to her prep list, tied her apron, and put on the playlist her sister had made her, Afrobeats, loud and relentless, and let the music carry her forward. That Friday evening, Denise tied the silver balloons to the door handle. 100 of them, because Mama Chisom had always said you don't celebrate halfway. She set up the folding tables outside for the family and friends who would come in the morning. She checked the sign one more time, running her fingers over the gold letters, and stood back to look at what 11 years of saved shifts and doubled holidays and her grandmother's recipe box had built. She was standing there, in the quiet of the evening, when Raymond Hollis watched her from his doorway across the street and decided she was suspicious. The grand opening was scheduled for 10 o'clock Saturday morning. Denise arrived at 8:30 to begin final prep. She was in her silk blouse because the photos were happening at 9. She had the store keys in her hand. She had 100 silver balloons on the door. She had guests arriving in 90 minutes, a local journalist who'd agreed to cover the story, and a text from her sister that said Mama Chisom is watching, and she is proud. Denise stood on the sidewalk in the early morning light, looking at the gold letters on the window, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Not from fear, from gratitude so overwhelming it felt like weight. She put her hand on the glass and whispered something to the photo inside. She didn't notice Raymond Hollis on the phone across the street. There's a woman loitering outside the vacant property on Cedar Lane. That was what Raymond told the dispatcher, not the property with the new sign, not the bakery with the balloons, the vacant property. As though 11 years and $87,000 and 8 months of renovation and 100 silver balloons could be made invisible by a single word. Loitering, as though Denise Okafor's presence in front of her own business, with her own keys, on the morning of her own grand opening, was something the police needed to address. The squad cars arrived in 4 minutes. Officer Tanya Webb got out first. She had 11 years on the force, and a particular radar for calls that didn't add up. 2 squad cars for a loitering report on a Saturday morning in a quiet retail district. She took in the scene before she took a step. A woman in a silk blouse, standing in front of a storefront decorated with silver balloons and gold lettering, holding keys. Not agitated, not hiding, just standing there with an expression that had shifted in the seconds since the cruisers arrived, from grief to something calm and waiting. Like a woman who had been here before, like a woman who knew exactly what was happening and had already decided how she was going to handle it. "Good morning," Officer Webb said. "We received a report of loitering. Can I ask your name and what you're doing here?" Denise Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded document. "My name is Denise Okafor. I own this property. My grand opening is in approximately 20 minutes. She held out the paper. "That's my lease, my business license, and my health inspection certificate. There's also a copy of the permit for the outdoor tables." She paused. "I carry them with me because this isn't the first time." Officer Webb looked at the documents. She looked at them carefully, not quickly. Read the lease, read the business license, checked the dates. Looked at the sign, looked at the balloons, looked at the folding tables set up for guests who would arrive in less than an hour. Looked at the woman in the silk blouse who was watching her with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be very, very calm in situations that weren't calm at all. A stillness that is not peace, exactly, but practice. The kind of composure you don't develop without occasion. Webb handed back the documents. "You're the owner. I am." Webb turned toward the street. Raymond Hollis was standing in the doorway of his shop, arms folded, watching. Webb held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back to Denise. "Do you know who made the call?" "I have a reasonable idea. Do you want to file a report?" Denise looked across the street at Raymond. He hadn't moved, still standing there with his arms folded, watching, the way he'd been watching for 3 years. She thought about Mama Chisum, who'd spent her whole life cooking for people who never asked her name. She thought about the recipe box, held together with rubber bands. She thought about the note still folded in her wallet. "Stop waiting. Open the door." "Not today," Denise said. "Today I have a grand opening." She looked at Officer Webb and a slight smile crossed her face. "But you're welcome to come. We have Puff Puff." Officer Webb looked at the balloons, looked at the sign. "Chisholm's," she said. "That's a good name. It was my grandmother's. She would have been proud." Denise touched the glass again, just briefly. "I know." The officers were still there when the first guests arrived. Not because the situation required them, it hadn't for the last 15 minutes, but because Officer Webb had in fact accepted the offer of Puff Puff, and her partner had done the same, and the two of them stood slightly off to the side while the sidewalk began to fill. Denise's sister appeared first, arms full of flowers. Then her catering clients, a dozen of them. People who'd eaten her food in their homes for years and wanted to be there for the moment she made it official. The barber came. The florist came, still teary, which set off Denise's sister immediately. Harold the contractor arrived in a button-down shirt and stood very straight while Denise hugged him and refused to let go for a long moment. The journalist arrived at 5 to 10 and took photographs of the crowd on the sidewalk, the gold letters on the window, the silver balloons, and Denise Okafor standing in front of the door she'd saved 11 years to open. At exactly 10 o'clock, Denise cut the ribbon, white satin, tied in a bow by her niece the night before, and opened the door, and the smell of warm pastry and cardamom and pepper and groundnut rolled out into Cedar Lane like a greeting. The first day's sales exceeded Denise's most optimistic projection by 40%. Raymond Hollis stood in his doorway and watched the crowd. There was no satisfaction in it. He'd made the call, and all it had done was produce 2 officers now standing on the sidewalk eating fried dough. He'd wanted the morning disrupted. Instead, the arrival of the police, which he'd imagined would create distance, suspicion, a kind of official disapproval, had become, in some way he couldn't entirely explain, part of the story of the opening. People on the sidewalk were asking about it. He could see them asking, could see Denise answering, calm and measured, and could see their expressions shift, not toward suspicion, but toward something else. Recognition, anger, briefly, redirected, and then back to the food and the laughter and the gold letters on the glass. The journalist, he realized too late, had been there for all of it. The story ran Monday morning, a feature, not a brief. The journalist had written about Chisholm's and its owner, the 11 years of savings and the grandmother's recipe box and the renovation done mostly by hand and the community that had gathered for the opening. She'd also written about the police call, not as the lead, but as a moment the article didn't avoid, before a single customer walked through the door. The owner of Chisholm's faced a situation familiar to many black business owners. Police called on them in their own space, in front of their own work. The article quoted Denise directly. "I carry my documents with me. I've learned to be prepared, but I will not spend the day I open my grandmother's restaurant being angry. I'll spend it being grateful." The article was shared 15,000 times by Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday, Chisholm's had a line out the door each morning. People who'd never been to Cedar Lane came specifically because of the story, and stayed because of the food. The chin chin sold out before noon every day. The pepper cinnamon rolls had a wait list. Denise hired her first employee by the end of the week, a young woman named Daisy who had just graduated from the same community college culinary program Denise had attended 15 years before. Raymond Hollis watched the line from his doorway. On Thursday of that week, a woman walked past Hollis Home Goods with a shopping bag from Chisholm's and a coffee from the cafe 3 doors down, and didn't pause at his window. He watched her go. He'd watched a lot of things from that doorway over 22 years, and he was beginning to understand that watching from a distance was not the same as seeing. He thought about the word he'd used on the phone with the dispatcher. Loitering. He thought about the silver balloons he'd looked at for weeks and chosen not to understand. He thought about 3 years of a woman waving at him across the street and him turning away, and what he'd told himself about that, and whether any of it had been true. He didn't go across the street that Thursday or Friday. The gap was too large and he didn't know how to cross it, and some things, once done, don't become undone by acknowledging them. He knew that. He had the article on his counter because he'd printed it to think about, which told him something about himself he wasn't sure he liked. 6 months after the grand opening, Cedar Lane held its first block association meeting since 2019. The florist organized it. The barber brought chairs. Denise brought food, naturally, a spread that covered 3 folding tables and made grown adults go quiet, and then immediately loud again. Officer Tanya Webb attended off-duty, which she would later describe to colleagues as the best professional decision she'd made in years. Harold the contractor attended and ate until he needed to sit down. Raymond Hollis stood on the sidewalk outside the meeting room for 11 minutes before he walked in. No one made a scene of it. Denise looked up when he entered, and he held her gaze, and he nodded once, and she nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't absolution, and it wasn't the end of anything complicated, but it was the first honest thing that had passed between them. The first acknowledgement that they were, whatever else was true, neighbors on the same block, in the same struggling row of storefronts, with more reason to be allies than enemies. He sat in the back, ate puff-puff, didn't speak much, but he stayed until the end. Chisholm celebrated its first anniversary the following March. Denise framed the newspaper article and hung it next to the photo of Mama Chisholm inside the front door, not as a wound to display, as a document. Proof of what it takes, and what it costs, and what gets built anyway. Her niece, home from her first year of college, asked her once why she kept the article up, why she didn't just focus on the good stuff, the success, all the people who'd come and stayed and come back. Denise looked at the article for a moment, then at the photo of her grandmother, laughing at someone off camera in a kitchen in 1974. Because both things are true, she said. The morning they called the police and the morning we opened the door are the same morning. You don't get to have one without the other. You carry what it cost you right next to what you built. She touched the frame, gently. That's how Mama Chisholm did it. That's how I do it. And one day, that's how you'll do it too. Outside on Cedar Lane, the morning crowd was already gathering, the line forming before the lights even came on inside, the smell of cardamom and warm pastry drifting through the March cold, the gold letters glinting in the early light. 100 silver balloons, replaced now with a small hand-painted sign in her grandmother's handwriting, "Welcome. You belong here." The door opened, and the day began.